Empaths are people who experience emotions in a very deep and intense way. They do not just understand how others feel from words or expressions, they actually sense it within themselves as if it becomes part of their own emotional world. The moods, energies, and silent pain of others are often felt by them without effort. This sensitivity makes them compassionate, understanding, and deeply connected to people. However, this same gift can also become a heavy burden over time. When life repeatedly exposes an empath to emotional pain or toxic environments, every experience leaves a lasting impression inside them. Slowly, these emotional experiences begin shaping not only their feelings, but also their identity and how they see themselves in relationships and life. Empaths naturally absorb emotions from people around them in a very automatic way. They do not need someone to explain their sadness or frustration because they feel it directly through emotional energy. When someone is upset, stressed, or angry, the empath immediately experiences a shift within themselves. Their heart feels heavier, their thoughts become more active, and their attention shifts toward helping or comforting the other person. This reaction is not something they consciously choose, it happens naturally. In positive environments, this ability creates strong emotional bonds and meaningful relationships. However, in draining or unhealthy environments, this same sensitivity makes them vulnerable to emotional exhaustion and inner imbalance. When an empath is repeatedly exposed to emotional pain, their inner world starts to feel overloaded. Every painful interaction adds another invisible layer of emotional weight inside them. Because empaths are naturally reflective, they do not simply move on from situations. Instead, they replay conversations in their mind, analyzing tone, words, and expressions again and again. They try to understand what went wrong or what they could have done differently. Over time, this deep reflection turns into mental fatigue. The mind becomes filled with unresolved emotions, and even small interactions can trigger emotional responses. This constant processing slowly drains their inner peace and creates a feeling of emotional heaviness that becomes difficult to escape. This constant replaying of situations leads to emotional exhaustion that is often invisible to others. Even when nothing is happening externally, the empath's mind remains active, going through past events and unresolved feelings. They rarely give themselves mental rest because their thoughts are always processing emotional experiences. As a result, their energy becomes depleted over time. This exhaustion does not only stay in the mind, it begins affecting their physical state as well. Many empaths start experiencing headaches, tiredness, body tension, or difficulty sleeping. Their nervous system stays alert for emotional stress, making it harder for them to relax fully, even in peaceful environments or moments of solitude. Another major challenge for empaths is their tendency to blame themselves during emotional conflicts. Because they are deeply compassionate and self-reflective, they often assume responsibility even when situations are not their fault. Instead of recognizing unhealthy behavior from others, they turn inward and question their own actions. They wonder if they were too sensitive, too emotional, or not understanding enough. This habit of self-questioning creates a cycle where they constantly try to improve themselves in order to maintain peace in relationships. However, this also deepens their emotional exhaustion because they are always adjusting themselves rather than recognizing when others are not treating them fairly. Even when they are emotionally drained, empaths continue to offer support to others. They listen, comfort, and give advice even when their own inner world feels heavy. Their natural instinct is to care even at the cost of their own well-being. This creates an imbalance where they are constantly giving but rarely receiving the same level of emotional support in return. Over time, this imbalance builds silent frustration inside them. One part of them feels exhausted and overwhelmed, while another part feels guilty for wanting space. This inner conflict makes it difficult for them to step back, even when they desperately need rest and emotional distance. Eventually, this continuous cycle leads to emotional burnout. The empath begins to feel drained in situations that once felt manageable. Conversations that once felt meaningful start feeling heavy. They may begin withdrawing from social interactions or needing more time alone to recover their energy. This withdrawal is not because they no longer care about people, but because their emotional system is overwhelmed. The desire to understand others remains, but it is now mixed with a strong need for personal peace. Their focus slowly shifts from constantly supporting others to trying to protect their own emotional stability. At a certain point, repeated emotional pain triggers a deeper internal shift. the empath begins to question their experiences more seriously. At first, they may still try harder, communicate more, or give more understanding, believing that things will improve if they just put in more effort. However, when the same painful patterns continue, they start noticing that effort alone is not changing the outcome. This is when their attention begins turning inward. Instead of only focusing on others' emotions, they start observing their own feelings more carefully and noticing how certain situations consistently affect their mental and emotional well-being. This shift marks the beginning of self-awareness. The empath starts recognizing patterns in their relationships. They notice how often they feel drained after certain interactions, or how some people repeatedly leave them feeling unappreciated or confused. They also begin to see that their emotional efforts are not always matched by others. These realizations do not come suddenly, but slowly build through reflection over time. As they connect past experiences, they begin to understand that certain emotional cycles are repeating. This awareness helps them see their relationships more clearly and understand their own emotional patterns better than before. With this growing awareness, a mix of emotions starts emerging inside them. They feel sadness when they realize how often their kindness was taken for granted. They feel frustration when they see how frequently they ignored their own needs to keep others comfortable. At times, they may even feel anger, both toward others and toward themselves, for allowing these patterns to continue for so long. These emotions can feel overwhelming, but they are also necessary. They help the empath break through old emotional habits and begin understanding their situation from a clearer and more grounded perspective. As this awareness deepens, their way of thinking slowly changes. Instead of automatically accepting responsibility for every conflict, they begin analyzing situations more objectively. They start asking whether their emotional energy is being respected, whether their efforts are being valued, and whether the relationship is truly balanced. This shift in questioning is very important because it marks the beginning of emotional independence. The empath is no longer only focused on keeping others happy, but is also starting to consider their own emotional well-being as equally important. They also begin to realize how their strong empathy may have caused them to tolerate unhealthy behavior for too long. Because they could sense the pain or struggles in others, they often excused actions that hurt them emotionally. They gave more chances, hoping things would improve, even when their inner feelings told them something was wrong. Recognizing this pattern is painful but also eye-opening. It helps them understand that empathy without boundaries can lead to emotional imbalance and self-neglect, even when intentions are good. As awareness continues to grow, the empath starts developing a stronger connection with their inner voice. They begin noticing subtle feelings they previously ignored, such as discomfort in certain situations or a quiet sense that something is not right. Instead of dismissing these signals, they start listening to them more carefully. This inner guidance becomes an important part of their emotional decision-making. They begin trusting their feelings more and slowly learning that their internal reactions are valid and meaningful, not something to be ignored or pushed aside for the sake of others. This growing inner awareness naturally leads to the development of emotional boundaries. The empath begins to understand that constantly giving without limits has a personal cost. For a long time, they may have believed that love means always being available, always understanding, and always supporting others no matter what. But repeated emotional pain begins to challenge this belief. They start realizing that true care does not require self-sacrifice to the point of emotional exhaustion. However, when they first try to set boundaries, it feels uncomfortable because their instinct is still to avoid conflict and maintain harmony. This is where an internal conflict begins to form. One part of the empath still wants to respond with their usual compassion and emotional availability. The other part, however, has become tired from repeated emotional strain and begins recognizing the need for self-protection. This second voice begins reminding them that their emotional energy is valuable and that constantly sacrificing their own well-being is not sustainable in the long run. Empaths are individuals who feel emotions in a very deep and intense way. They can easily sense the moods, energies, and hidden emotional pain of other people around them. This sensitivity allows them to understand others on a level that goes beyond words or expressions. While this ability is a powerful gift that helps them form deep emotional connections, it can also become a silent burden in their lives. When an empath is repeatedly exposed to emotional pain or unhealthy environments, each experience leaves a mark not only on their heart, but also on their mind and sense of identity. Over time, these emotional experiences slowly shape how they think, feel, and respond to relationships, often changing their inner world in ways they do not immediately realize. Empaths naturally absorb emotions from people around them without conscious effort. They do not simply hear someone's sadness or frustration, they feel it within themselves as if it becomes their own experience. When someone close to them is upset, angry, or struggling, the empath instantly reacts internally. Their heart feels heavier, their thoughts become more active, and they develop a strong emotional urge to help or comfort that person. This reaction is not forced, it happens naturally because of their emotional sensitivity. In supportive and healthy environments, this ability helps create strong bonds and meaningful relationships. However, in toxic or emotionally draining situations, it can become overwhelming and lead to emotional strain. When empaths experience repeated emotional pain, their internal emotional system begins to feel overloaded. Every difficult interaction adds another layer of emotional weight that they carry silently. Because they are naturally reflective, they do not easily let go of what happens to them. Instead, they replay conversations, tones, and emotional reactions in their mind, trying to fully understand every detail. They often question what went wrong or what they could have done differently. This constant overthinking slowly turns into mental exhaustion. Their mind becomes filled with unresolved emotional experiences, and even when nothing is happening externally, they continue to process past pain internally, which drains their mental peace over time. This continuous internal processing eventually leads to deep emotional fatigue that others may not notice. Even in moments of silence or solitude, their thoughts remain active, moving through old conversations, conflicts, and misunderstandings. Because they rarely release emotions quickly, everything stays within them for longer periods. This creates a constant emotional pressure that gradually reduces their inner energy. Over time, their nervous system also becomes affected, often leading to physical symptoms such as tiredness, headaches, or sleep difficulties. They may also remain in a state of emotional alertness, always expecting something emotionally heavy to happen again, which prevents them from fully relaxing. Another important struggle for empaths is their tendency to blame themselves during emotional conflicts. Due to their compassionate and introspective nature, they often assume responsibility even when situations are not their fault. Instead of immediately recognizing unhealthy behavior from others, they look inward and question their own actions. They may wonder if they were too sensitive, too emotional, or not understanding enough. This constant self-questioning creates emotional pressure because they continuously try to fix themselves in order to maintain harmony in relationships. However, this also deepens their exhaustion because they are always adjusting themselves instead of recognizing unhealthy patterns in others. Even when they feel emotionally drained, empaths continue to offer support to others. They listen carefully, provide comfort, and try to help even when their own emotional state is weak. Their natural instinct is to care even at the cost of their own well-being. This creates an emotional imbalance where they are constantly giving but rarely receiving the same level of support in return. Over time, this imbalance creates silent emotional frustration. One part of them feels overwhelmed and tired, while another part feels guilty for wanting space or distance. This internal conflict makes it difficult for them to step back, even when they truly need rest. Eventually, this ongoing cycle leads to emotional burnout. The empath begins to feel drained in situations that once felt normal or manageable. Conversations that once felt meaningful start to feel heavy or exhausting. They may begin withdrawing from social interactions or spending more time alone in order to recover their emotional energy. This withdrawal is not due to a lack of care for others, but due to emotional overload. Their desire to understand people remains, but it is now mixed with a strong need to protect their own mental and emotional stability. This marks the beginning of an important internal shift. At a deeper level, repeated emotional pain starts triggering a change in how empaths view their experiences. At first, they may continue trying harder, communicating more, and offering greater patience, believing that things will improve through effort alone. However, when the same painful patterns continue, they begin to notice that their efforts are not changing the outcome. This realization slowly shifts their attention inward. Instead of focusing only on others' emotions, they start observing their own emotional responses more carefully and noticing how certain interactions consistently affect their mental state. This growing awareness becomes the foundation of self-awareness. The empath begins identifying patterns in their relationships. They notice how often they feel emotionally drained after certain conversations, or how certain people repeatedly leave them feeling unappreciated or confused. They also recognize that their emotional efforts are not always matched or valued in return. These realizations do not happen suddenly, but develop gradually through reflection and repeated emotional experiences. As they begin connecting these patterns, they start understanding their relationships and their role within them in a much clearer way than before. With this awareness, different emotions begin to surface. They may feel sadness when they realize how often their kindness was taken for granted. They may feel frustration when they see how many times they ignored their own needs to keep others comfortable. At times, they may even feel anger toward themselves for allowing certain patterns to continue for so long. Although these emotions can feel heavy, they are also necessary for growth. They help the empath break old emotional cycles and begin seeing their experiences with greater clarity and honesty. As awareness deepens, their thinking begins to shift. Instead of automatically taking responsibility for every emotional conflict, they start analyzing situations more objectively. They begin asking whether their emotional energy is being respected and whether the relationship is truly balanced. This change in questioning marks an important step in emotional development. It shows that the empath is no longer only focused on keeping others happy, but is also beginning to value their own emotional well-being equally. They also start realizing how their empathy has influenced their choices in relationships. Because they could understand the pain behind others' behavior, they often tolerated disrespect or emotional imbalance for too long. They gave multiple chances, hoping situations would improve, even when their intuition suggested otherwise. Recognizing this pattern is painful, but it also helps them understand how empathy without boundaries can lead to self-neglect. As this understanding grows, they begin to connect more strongly with their inner voice. They start noticing subtle emotional signals they previously ignored, such as discomfort, hesitation, or inner tension. Instead of dismissing these feelings, they begin to treat them as important guidance. This marks the beginning of emotional self-trust, where the empath starts relying on their inner sense of clarity rather than only external explanations or emotional pressure from others. This growing awareness naturally leads to the formation of emotional boundaries. The empath begins to understand that constantly giving without limits has a personal cost. For a long time, they may have believed that love meant always being available and always understanding others, no matter what. But repeated emotional pain begins to challenge this belief. They realize that caring for others should not require sacrificing their own emotional stability. However, when they first try to set boundaries, it feels uncomfortable because it goes against their natural tendency to avoid conflict. At this stage, an internal conflict emerges. One part of them still wants to respond with the same compassion they always have. Another part of them feels exhausted from repeated emotional hurt and begins recognizing the need for self-protection. This new voice reminds them that their emotional energy is valuable and cannot be endlessly drained without consequences. Over time, this awareness becomes stronger and begins guiding their behavior toward healthier emotional balance. As time passes, this inner voice continues to grow stronger. The empath starts noticing situations where their emotional generosity is being stretched too far. They may observe how certain people only reach out when they need something, but rarely offer support in return. They begin recognizing conversations where only one person's problems are discussed while their own feelings remain unheard. These realizations strengthen their determination to protect their emotional space and create healthier limits. As boundaries begin forming, their behavior slowly changes. Instead of immediately responding to every emotional demand, they begin creating space between themselves and situations. They may take longer to reply to messages, avoid conversations when emotionally drained, or step away from conflicts that once consumed them. These small actions represent significant internal growth. Learning to say no becomes an important turning point. What once felt impossible now becomes an act of self-respect rather than rejection. With boundaries in place, empaths become more selective about where they invest their emotional energy. They begin focusing on relationships that are supportive, balanced, and respectful. They understand that healthy connections allow emotional care to flow in both directions. As a result, their emotional stability begins to improve. Situations that once felt overwhelming no longer affect them with the same intensity, and they feel less pressure to manage everyone's emotions. This gradual transformation leads to emotional detachment as a form of protection. It does not mean they stop caring. Instead, they begin observing emotions without absorbing them completely. They learn to recognize what belongs to them and what belongs to others. This creates emotional distance that helps them maintain inner stability while still remaining compassionate. As this detachment grows, their reactions become calmer and more thoughtful. Instead of being overwhelmed by others' emotions, they pause and evaluate situations before responding. They understand that not every emotional burden is theirs to carry. This awareness allows them to remain balanced even in emotionally intense environments. Another major realization is that they cannot rescue everyone. Earlier, they may have believed that enough patience and care could fix every situation, but experience teaches them that each person must take responsibility for their own healing. This understanding helps them step back from emotional situations that once consumed their energy and focus more on their own stability. Over time, this balanced detachment strengthens their emotional resilience. They remain empathetic but no longer overwhelmed. Their compassion becomes more controlled, allowing them to support others without losing themselves in the process. Their emotional intelligence deepens as empathy begins working alongside awareness and experience rather than emotion alone. As this transformation continues, their compassion evolves into wisdom. They begin recognizing patterns in human behavior more clearly, understanding that not all emotional expressions are sincere. Some people may use vulnerability without change, while others may rely on empathy without taking responsibility for their actions. These realizations help the empath refine how they apply compassion. Instead of reacting purely from emotion, they begin observing situations more carefully. They notice repeated apologies without change, promises without action, and emotional manipulation disguised as vulnerability. Their ability to read emotional patterns becomes sharper, helping them distinguish sincerity from imbalance. This shift brings a deeper understanding that while empathy helps explain behavior, it does not justify repeated harm. Their emotional intelligence strengthens as they begin recognizing not only others' feelings, but also the health and balance of relationships themselves. They learn to evaluate whether connections are respectful, stable, and mutually supportive. Their compassion becomes intentional rather than automatic. Instead of giving emotional energy everywhere, they begin directing it toward relationships that truly value and respect it. They understand that empathy grows best in environments where it is appreciated and returned. This balance helps them protect their inner peace while still remaining kind. A key development in this stage is trust in their intuition. Over time, they begin recognizing emotional signals more clearly and learning to trust them. What once felt like confusion or doubt becomes a source of guidance. They stop ignoring internal warnings and start using them to make better emotional decisions. Through this process, their kindness does not disappear. Instead, it becomes supported by experience, awareness, and emotional clarity. Compassion is no longer blind, it is guided by understanding and self-respect. This creates a stronger and more balanced emotional foundation. After moving through exhaustion, awareness, boundaries, detachment, and wisdom, the empath eventually develops a quiet inner strength. This strength is calm, stable, and deeply rooted in self-understanding. It does not need to prove itself loudly, but reflects in their behavior, decisions, and emotional control. In the past, they may have depended heavily on others' approval to feel emotionally stable. Conflict or disapproval once created deep discomfort, leading them to over-apologize or sacrifice their needs. With growth, this pattern begins to change. They realize their worth is not dependent on pleasing others or maintaining constant harmony.